Welcome to the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council meeting for our first meeting of 2023. Appreciate you all being here. We do have a quorum present. I'd like to go around the table here and have council members and others introduce themselves, and then we'll go through the guests. So, Joe, let's start with you.
Good morning, Joe Havaski, Extractive Industry, Compass Minerals.
Wayne?
Wayne Wirtzbaugh, Utah State University.
If you could please unmute the microphone, those remote and the recording's not able to record that.
Joanna Terwada, Utah State University.
Jim Harris, Division of Water Quality.
Tom Tripp, Twilla County.
Go ahead, Marissa.
Marissa Weinberg, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and also filling in as the interim Great Salt Lake coordinator.
Jeff Richards, I represent the migratory bird production areas.
Anna Ville with the Nature Conservancy.
Don Leonard, representing aquaculture.
Leland Myers, POTWs.
Dina Blaze, Salt Lake County.
Mark?
Tom Ward online representing municipalities.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome.
Mark Reynolds, U.S. MAC.
Ryan Doherty, Cardinal Salt.
Ben DeFreitos, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Justin Blaker, Jacobs.
Stoneley Water Resources.
Lisa Welch, Utah State University.
Guest. Monjo Masson, Central Davis Sewer.
Ben Holcomb, Division of Water Quality.
Ray Ward, Utah Legislature. My district is Bountiful, West Bountiful.
Kathy Davis, Utah Attorney General's Office, represented Public Lands Coordinating.
Tony Ramsden, Utah AG.
Jan Streifel, with the Women Voters.
Todd Adams, Utah Development.
Chris Mandel, Compass Minerals.
Ben Clark, Alan Dupree, Compass Minerals.
Blake Bingham, Water Rights. Ben Starkey with the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Emma Whitaker, Utah Attorney General's Office, and Council for Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Okay, we also have a number of people online. We do have a quorum present. An agenda was circulated to members prior to the meeting, and we received no requests for changes or revisions, so I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
Motion to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
Dina. Thank you, Leland. Third. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Any abstentions? That's unanimous. You also received meeting notes of our meeting of November 2, 2022. We've received no requests for modifications, so I'd entertain a motion to approve those meeting notes.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Ann. Leland, second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay.
One abstention, I was not here.
Okay, thank you, Dina. Okay, I did want to note, and you're all aware that Laura Vernon, who's been the one of our support folks for a number of years, has taken a position in the Division of Water Resources and has left her position as Great Salt Lake Coordinator. In the interim, while the department runs through their necessary processes, Marissa Weinberg is stepping in to fill that role. Marissa, thank you very much. Appreciate that. I would like to entertain a motion to express appreciation to Laura for her many years of service and her support and her help. I thought she did a terrific job and helped guide us in many ways. And so I'd entertain a motion to express appreciation to Laura Vernon for her support for the lake and support for the advisory council. Someone
Emphatically moved.
Emphatically.
So moved.
Got a second? All in favor say aye.
Emphatic second.
Any opposed, nay?
Aye.
Any abstentions? Okay, we have a busy, full agenda today. So let's launch right into it. Our first presentation will be by Jim Harris, the Utah Division of Water Quality, regarding Gilbert Bay assessment. Jim, you're on.
Thanks again, Don, for getting me on the agenda. The timing of this is important, so appreciate that. We presented this earlier this week to the Salinity Advisory Committee, and so many of you were there. But just as a little bit of background first, in October, Friends of the Great Salt Lake petitioned the Division of Water Quality to make an emergency listing of Gilbert Bay as part of our 2022 integrated report. As some maybe a little bit deeper background, for those who are not familiar, our integrated report is a biennial report to Congress on the status of the state's waters. It includes the key aspect that it includes is the 303D list, which is a list of threatened or impaired water bodies. And this is what Friends of the Great Salt Lake was requesting that we add the Gilbert Bay to. That report is kind of integral to a lot of our programs in that it sets off a course of action that to typically develop watershed strategies or what we call total maximum daily loads, but they're strategies to reduce pollution and get them back into compliance with our standards. That's in a nutshell. It's a little more complicated than that. But in the interest of time, we are seriously considering this action on this on this request. But I want to be clear about that. It's still under consideration. We're in a mode of gathering feedback from partners, key partners, agencies, et cetera, to better build our justification for this process. So I think we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We have not made a formal action. And if and when that occurs, DWQ will issue a 30-day public notice, and that will be a more formal opportunity for folks to provide their feedback to the Division of Water Quality. Depending on the outcome of that, if we propose a change to the 303D list, EPA will have another 30 days to respond to our request. So that was a little bit of introductory background. In addition to some of that background information, I should say, so you understand the context in which we're working in, we have limited standards developed for the lake. However, we have identified the uses for the lake to be frequent primary and secondary contact recreation, waterfowl, shorebirds, and other water-oriented wildlife, including their necessary food chain. And so more broadly, that aquatic life use it includes the brine shrimp, the brine flies, birds, algae, and other microorganisms. And the one criterion that we have in our standards for Gilbert Bay is a selenium bird tissue, shorebird tissue criterion. And so as a result, we've performed assessments on that one parameter, and we found that the lake status that we report to EPA is a Category 2, which simply means that some, but not all of those uses have been assessed because of the limited nature of that assessment. However, lacking these criteria, our narrative standards still apply, and our biological assessment rules still apply to the lake, and I'll talk about that later. This is something that you guys are all very familiar with intimately, but we've seen a long-term decline in the lake since the late 80s at its peak, but it's more recently been precipitously dropping, and unfortunately has reached an all-time low this fall, recorded low of 4188.5 feet. Where this really affects things is both in the increasing salinity of the lake by concentrating the salt mass in the lake. But another thing we want to point out is that it also exposes critical habitat that as the lake recedes. And that's another important part of the community of the lake, the biota of the lake that is impacted by this dropping elevation. As these microbialites desiccate and decay, they're important brine fly habitat for brine fly larvae, et cetera. And here's the key relationship between the dropping elevation and the increasing salinity that we've all seen many times. And this is one of the foundations for our consideration for the potential impairment. And this derives out of a lot of the work that the Salinity Advisory Committee has done over the years to define ideal ranges of salinity for key biota in the lake. And highlighted there, which you guys have seen this graphic, so I don't need to interpret it too much, but highlighted, the green arrows on the left are the microbialite, the brine flies, and the brine shrimp. And the dotted line represents kind of where we were in November of this year at 185 grams per liter of salinity. So it's outside that ideal range, and so that's one of the lines of evidence that we're using as a foundation for our evaluation of the Gilbert Bay. As I mentioned, our narrative water quality standard states that concentrations or combinations of substances which produce undesirable physiological responses in desirable resident fish or other desirable aquatic life are a clear violation of Utah's water quality rules. It's a very broad category or a way of assessing a water body, but it allows us the ability to make a determination, and what we're considering is recategorizing Gilbert Bay's biological community as threatened and likely to be impaired if these trends of lower elevation and higher salinity continue over time. The threatened category 5 basically, by definition, states that one or more uses are likely to become impaired by the next integrated report cycle. That would be our 2024 integrated report cycle. The way our assessment methods are written, what we would do is to append this decision to our current integrated report. Let me rephrase that. We don't really have a method for an emergency listing, so this is the first time we've been requesting this, but we would append that to our 2022 integrated report, and we would confirm that status in 2024 and then make a final determination in the 2026 integrated report. And I think what this timeline kind of indicates to or gives to us is that an opportunity to look at other lines of evidence, to track these trends, to gather possibly cause and effects that we are anticipating are going to happen if the salinity continues to increase. So I just want to talk a little bit about implications because this is kind of part of our outreach. We've gotten a lot of questions internally and externally. We're not anticipating that this is going to have permit implications as most listings do. And this is primarily due to what the cause is. It is largely driven by the salt mass in the lake. It's a naturally saline lake, and the elevation changes have caused a concentration of that salinity. And so we don't see that this will have permanent implications to dischargers in the basin, given the minimal impacts that they currently have. And we also protect for other uses in the watershed related to salinity through our TDS standards for agricultural uses and so forth. And so it's not like we're ignoring the TDS sources in the basin. And we feel that the strength of this potential listing is that we're able to communicate along with our partner agencies to support ongoing strategies. The state has already begun to direct resources to the Great Salt Lake. We have an integrated watershed assessment that's just taken foot, and we feel like we can play a role in supporting that process. And then this group is very well aware of all the ongoing efforts intended to increase flows to the Great Salt Lake, agricultural conservation, M&I conservation, all of the legal mechanisms that have been developed for assessing those. And so I think in terms of next steps, we have the ability to adopt a lot of state strategies. These are local decisions that the state is making to address the problem in the lake. And I think that could satisfy a lot of the watershed restoration requirements of the Clean Water Act to address a potential threatened status of the lake. And so I have a lot of a hope that we can contribute to that, and that if the state is effective in that, it could qualify for some of the, what we call advanced restoration strategies to address a potential impairment, so.
So,
Questions?
since it says questions, I'm just
Yeah.
going to make a statement.
Turn on your mic.
I would not be one who would want to ever, mind you, let me get the mic over here because no one's going to hear me if I don't yell into it, right? I would be not one who ever want to speak against what Friends of Great Salt Lake want because they are good folks. But having said that, I'm wondering if this isn't a misplaced approach to trying to look at and address the urgency of trying to protect Great Salt Lake for two reasons. Number one, the narrative standard, what you quoted up there was in the section of the middle of it, but the beginning of the narrative standard states it shall be unlawful and a violation of these rules for any person to discharge or place any waste or other substance in any such way as will be or may be offensive, such as unnatural deposits, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes on and says what you said. This is not caused by someone unlawful or a violation of the rules discharging anything to the lake. And so the narrative standard as a means of stopping a discharge that is causing a problem that's not specifically designed in the rules as a specific criteria, to me doesn't apply. While I'd like it to, I worry that what you could do is say, because as I understand it, maybe I'm wrong because it was a long time ago when I heard this, but doesn't Great Salt Lake Minerals have a permit to discharge their brine from their ponds to the lake? We do. You do, right? So wouldn't it be suggested that somebody could say if you're saying it's declared as a problem, then that higher brine discharge could be said to have to be stopped. And I don't think that's appropriate under the narrative standard. Secondly, the biological standard states the assessment criteria for the state shall be free from human-induced stressors. The assumption here is that human-induced stressor is the lack of water, the use of that water upstream. What you're looking at is a water right issue, not a water quality issue. And I think there's a more appropriate place for that to be dealt with. And I think the legislature is looking at that very seriously to try and make those adjustments. So I just think it's inappropriate to use the water quality criteria standards to try and declare an impairment when in fact it doesn't approach, like you said, no permit except for possibly Great Salt Lake Minerals, who could be said, somebody could then say, well, you've said it's impaired for salinity, essentially what you're declaring it. They're discharging high salinity. And, oh, by the way, let's see. U.S. MagCorp is taking water out, which might create higher degree of salinity. Therefore, you're going to stop them from working and doing what they've done from an economic benefit not being considered. Honestly, I just think it's misplaced to utilize the water quality criteria in the narrative standard to do what you're suggesting they would like to have you do. There you go.
Point taken.
Go ahead, Tom.
I appreciate everything Leland just said. And I think when you said you're going to go up the watershed, which I think is what you're thinking about for conservation, I think that does cause us to worry about water rights for everybody in the watershed. We talk about an ideal range of salinity, and that's what was identified by the Salinity Advisory Council. And we're out of the optimum range. I think everyone recognizes that. But it's not like we killed anything yet or that there aren't robust populations out in our lake at this point. So I'm a little bit worried about the emergency nature. And when we go into this, because of its strange situation, it's going to be hard to propose a threshold to know when we get back out of this problem. Are we going to pick a salinity that's only in the ideal range? Or when we approach the ideal range, can we change what it was we were doing? And when you look at the situation for conservation, I don't think we can reach that. If we want to get back to 4190 or 4195, you've got to come up with millions of acre feet of water additional to get those levels back up. And that's a very difficult thing to achieve. For example, if everybody in the Great Salt Lake Basin quit using any water for a month, that would raise the lake an inch. So if we all just take a month off don't use any water anywhere here around the Great Salt Lake, will increase an inch. That's how dire the conservation measures would have to be to do much of anything. So I think we need to look more at evaporation control, which is what's being proposed by the Salinity Committee. And doing that, as has been pointed out, puts Compass Minerals in a hard place. And if we choose to do that, I think we ought to think about expending money to make sure that there's a feed supply for Compass so they can continue. When I look at EPA intervening, I don't think that's a fast method. The Salton Sea was, I think, listed for impairment in 2012. In 2022 February, they put out their draft implementation plan of how they're going to solve that problem. So I don't think this makes us more agile to bring in EPA's involvement. I think it probably makes us less agile. I think we have more expertise on the Great Salt Lake in the state of Utah than EPA currently has. This is outside of their paradigm for dealing with impairment, and I'm not sure that we bring any value by going to this. Is it an emergency this year? I don't know. You're going to move it to a Category 2, and you're still to get to Category 5 to be impaired. I don't know if that can count as an emergency. So anyway, my comments.
Other comments by council members? Questions? How about from the audience? Lynn?
I appreciate, oh.
Thank you, Leland. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate the digestion of our emergency petition request. And, you know, I can't speak legally about, you know, the background on the work of this, but I think we all recognize that it is an opportunity for the Division of Water Quality to think about this, and with consideration of the points that you've just made. And so, since it is a tool, we wanted to exercise it and generate conversation around it and see where we might go with this. So again, with all due respects, I really appreciate hearing this. I heard basically the essence of this yesterday, was it? Salinity Advisory Committee. So it's an ongoing cogitation. And to Jim saying, you know, we're giving this some thought, we're talking about this, we're sharing this publicly to get reactions. That's exactly what we want to happen. So thank you very much.
Don, if I may make a comment. We understand, representing extractive industry, we understand, you know, the urgency to do something, and we've taken drastic measures in July this year of constructing a salinity berm, which has shown initial success in terms of blocking north to south flow, which was the objective, to block that and contain that in the north arm to reduce the salinity from coming in. It's shown to be effective. But that's a very recent construction, and it takes time for dilution to occur in Gilbert Bay. So one of my thoughts is probably haven't given it enough time to adequately assess. We're talking about further measures, and not to get into the weeds from the discussion in the Salinity Advisory Committee, but there's a very reasonable platform that extractive industry might be supportive of. That is a very temporary, a 2023 solution. If you were to construct that, you'd be able to contain possibly 2 feet of elevation rise. And a very good point was brought up in that Salinity Advisory Committee meeting. Modeling has its shortcomings. And there's a lot of models out there, and they're just not perfect. But we might look at the last time the north arm was cut off from the lake, and looking at what elevations we're doing relative to salinity in the 2014 to 16 timeframe. Well, when when the causeway was blocked, you actually had and the south arm was containing all of the inflows, you actually had a migration from 160 grams per liter to 110 grams per liter. Over 3.3 feet of inflow that year. You can relate that to about 15 grams per liter benefit per each foot of elevation gain. What's being proposed in the, is this bad? What's being proposed in the in this reasonable position on this salinity berm, if you had a 2-foot gain, which praying the snowpack continues to grow, you might expect a 30 grams per liter increase, which would get us out of the woods. So I think I agree with Tom and Leland in that I feel that this is premature at this point when there are actions that have been taken and are possibly additional actions taken in the near term before we really take this kind of leap. Thank you.
Yeah, one more comment. While I'm opposed to the use of the listing process, I would be highly supportive of the division and the Water Quality Board looking at the water quality and the biological assessment of increasing selenium and stating that it is alarming to the ecosystem to see that occur, and that to take the position that we need to do more to prevent this from occurring and continuing in that direction. So I think that there is a lot that could be said for taking a position on that, but not using the listing process because of the way the regulatory statements are issued. I don't believe it is appropriate under that. But to be alarmed about it, yes, I think we all should be.
One more quick comment or question?
Yeah, and just one follow-up, Jim. One of the things you mentioned as a benefit was communication. I think in the state, at least, I think we're pretty widely aware of the problems. I see it frequently, even in the national press. So I think we don't need to raise the flag too much higher, because I think everyone's aware that this is a substantial problem, and it's not one we can easily solve.
Jim, thank you so much for being here and sharing that with us.
Chairman, could you please check your microphone? We're unable to get you on the recording.
Legislative session starting next week, and we typically at our first meeting of the year take a look at what might be coming up relating to the Great Salt Lake. We've asked Jim Fox, who we've been introducing as a representative for years. Now we're introducing as a former representative.
Thanks, Don. I wish it actually feels kind of good to be a former representative, given that the session starts a week from today. It's amazing. It feels like a burden lifted. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk to this group and to have served in the legislature, and for my colleagues that remain who are doing some great work. So I'll try to blaze through this. It's a little bit of a look back and then a look forward in terms of what we see. How do you top last year, which was the year of the Great Salt Lakes, what was dubbed in the press? We had the governor announcing his budget from the shores of Great Salt Lake. We had House Speaker Brad Wilson hosted not one but two summits for policymakers to draw attention to the lake. So I just wanted to point out that when we talk about policy response, it's not just bills or legislation enacted, it's also the dollars invested. There's also regulatory responses, and I think those are some of the ones that are getting a lot of attention right now, but that's part of the response. I'd also point out that last year, I think after the session, the Great Salt Lake Caucus, a bipartisan caucus of legislators, formed to draw greater attention to this issue. And sometimes there's actions that go on behind the scenes that even fall outside of this. For example, I was just talking to Representative Ward, who's here today, and appreciate his time and attention. While he doesn't have a bill teed up, he's working on some long-term water planning issues that really profoundly affect Great Salt Lake. So there's a lot of ways that there's sort of, I guess you might say, broadly government response to Great Salt Lake issues. I won't reiterate this, but again, just to show very significant legislation that passed last year. All those in bold directly affected the lake. The other ones had significant indirect effects. real significant investment in both policy and dollars last year. And then the agencies started to do some things behind the scenes as well. There was a reduction in the depth of the state-managed wildlife management areas, just a reduction of water to try to send more water to the open water of Great Salt Lake. There was, and this has been discussed already, in July, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands acted to raise the causeway, the adaptive management berm in the breach to restrict the flow of heavy brines from north to south, and that was put in place quickly, and it's been doing its job. Also, sort of quasi-governmental, the Water Conservancy districts made a commitment to send up to 30,000 acre-feet additional water downstream to Great Salt Lake. And then the investments are significant. In 2021, I think we were thrilled to get $1 million out of the legislature for applied research on the lake, but then we saw last year, boy, $50 million direct for Great Salt Lake, $40 million for its water supply, an additional $400 million in water conservation of one sort or another, and then significant federal action, part of the Inflation Reduction Act, sort of inaptly named, but $4 billion for drought response, and there's some good indications the Great Salt Lake may qualify for some of that federal money. So now, looking forward, what does that look like? How do we top that? Well, the first place to look is the governor's budget, and I will say this: sometimes governor's budgets are really used positionally. Legislature is the one that passes the budget, right? And so sometimes it's like they take the governor's budget, throw it right in the trash. But I will say Governor Cox does a good job in terms of running the trap lines early with legislators to try to get consensus on broad directions and sometimes on specific dollars. I say that because I think it's likely that some of these priorities get funded at or near the levels requested. But we can see additional investments in water conservation, just educating the public on the important need to conserve. Interesting, a big chunk of the state last year, despite record drought, did not have conservation measures of any sort in place because of the storage situation. So we need greater education. $5 million for turf rebates. Interesting, could be matched with $6 million that the Water Conservancy districts already have, so $11 million to encourage people to rip their strip or replace turf with less water-intensive landscapes. A huge proposed investment in agricultural water optimization. This is farmers and ranchers could adopt new water-saving technologies, but in many cases can't or won't because they simply can't afford to make the investment. This comes in with a match and makes that more affordable and encourages them to do that. We invested $70 million last year. This year the proposal is to really upscale that to $200 million. But you can see the savings, potential savings are significant as well, up to 200,000 acre-feet. That's probably rosy, but we all know that this actually works to optimize our water system. Not directly affects Great Salt Lake, but indirectly probably has some important benefits. And then if we were thrilled to see an investment of $50 million, the governor is proposing $133 million for Great Salt Lake this year. You can see the breakdown below. $1.3 million out of the Sovereign Lands Management account, which comes from the mineral royalties to help manage salinity and the landscapes in and around Great Salt Lake. Some additional, some significant money for high-resolution data on Great Salt Lake and Bear Lake to hopefully inform some decisions moving forward. An additional $25 million for the Water Trust. Now, the trust is just getting up and running now, but we know that its long-term needs are much greater even than 40 plus 25. If that's going to work long term and give the Great Salt Lake a seat at the table when it comes to water rights, they need these resources, particularly when we have those resources to dedicate. And then this last one's kind of interesting. You've seen and you've heard this discussion of salinity. Listen, there's only a couple of things that the state can do in terms of salinity. One is further management of the adaptive management berm, a modification of that berm. The other thing is, is there any way to get an emergency plug of water downstream? And the idea here is, with there not being adequate time to set up, say, water banks and some of these more long-term solutions, can we just go to water users up and down the watershed and say, can you get by with less this year? If you can, we can pay you. Here's the money. Let's try to get blocks of water and move them downstream to the open water of the Great Salt Lake. So there's a proposal for up to $100 million to do just that. I mentioned the federal response before with the significant investments, but also in late December, Congress passed, and it's amazing to me to say that Congress passed anything, but they did manage to pass a bill. It was the Saline Lake Ecosystems in the Great Basin States program, kind of mouthful, but Representative Moore was the principal sponsor. It sets aside $25 million really for applied research and to coordinate among stakeholders in managing terminal lakes around the West, which of course includes Great Salt Lake, but other wetlands around the West that play an important role in sort of regional ecology. So that, just again, is just another piece in the puzzle. Now, legislation, I threw up a bunch of question marks. Why? Because honestly, we don't know what all is out there just yet. Many bills are still boxcar bills, or they're being drafted, and so we don't know what's in them. I'm sure that bills will emerge as we move forward. We can point to a few that I'm aware of that are coming. Representative Doug Owens has one on water-efficient landscaping, really within the Great Salt Lake watershed, how to encourage municipalities to adopt more water-wise ordinances and incentives for homeowners. Senator Scott Sandel has one that really upscales water conservation. Again, incentives for homeowners to, this is really on the municipal and the industrial side, to be more efficient with their water. And Representative Galen Benyon has a program really designed to help schools reduce their water use and their energy consumption, again within the watershed, all the watersheds that feed into Great Salt Lake. I'm sure there are more. And then this is my last slide, but just to talk a little bit about agency action. Again, this has been discussed, and Joe was just talking about this. You know, there's a proposal to further modify the causeway breach to basically raise it even further and to cut off the exchange of water from south to north. And the question is, why would you do that? We just monkeyed with it, right? Why would we do that? Well, all of those numbers that you can't see very well on the left, or why we would do that, is a lot of people, this last summer, we hit salinities, very concerning salinity levels. I don't think, it kind of snuck up on everybody. Most people were thinking about lake elevations. Well, suddenly salinities really started to trip through critical thresholds and really raise some concerns about what was going to happen to the Gilbert Bay ecosystem. And the numbers that you see in yellow were sort of projections. Well, if we have another anemic year, where does salinity go? Not now. Now the salinity is okay, it's starting to moderate. But what about next summer when we have another hot, dry summer? What happens then? And the scary thing is we started to see that under bad scenarios, you're hitting 22% salinity. That effectively kills the ecosystem of Gilbert Bay. But even under good water scenarios, you were hitting 21%, probably past all those critical thresholds for that ecosystem. That raises endangered species threats to water rights, everything else, and not to mention the collapse of the ecosystem. So that's of enormous concern, and so the idea is there anything we can do to avoid that disaster, to avoid going off that cliff? And again, there's only really two things you can do. One is shrink the size of the bowl so that the water dilutes more, and if you cut off that north arm, that's what it does. It reduces the effective surface area by 40%, so that the water that comes in has a greater dilution effect, right? And then the second thing is just put more water in there. And that's what that whole demand management kind of proposal is to doing. Now, not without controversy, that puts Compass in the crosshairs a little bit because they draw their water from the North Arm. But I just wanted to give a little shout out to Joe and Compass. They have been long-term partners and stakeholders on Great Salt Lake. They've been cognizant of things like this. They've tried as much as they can, I think, within the constraints of their operations, try to work constructively with other lakeholders. They recognize the potential threats posed by salinity. So I would commend the mineral industry for the way they've tried to engage constructively on this process. But this is another agency action that's in the offing that's being considered right now. For what it's worth, I think you have to err on the side of caution. We have to try to overshoot a little bit and then claw it back if we can, because what we can't afford is to undershoot and get it wrong. Will that ecosystem bounce back? Yeah, but maybe 10 or 15 years from now, and all of those short-term harms will accumulate. So that's something that the agency's looking at. That is a government action, and that's hopefully a little bit of an overview for the group, Don.
Thank you, Tim. Time for a quick question or comment or addition?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Nina.
So various meetings that I've been to, there's been the discussion about how many acre feet are now going to be sent down to the Great Salt Lake. Who's tracking all that? Like the Point of the Mountain talked about it yesterday in their land authority. You brought up the water districts. So who's in charge of sort of tracking that? And making sure it happens and giving us kind of an aggregate understanding of what we can expect year to year?
Thanks, Dina. It's a great question. Our state engineer is kind of our umpire when it comes to water rights and understanding how water moves. And they're actually very well equipped to figure out where water moves from A to B. So in terms of that, you know, we have that person to kind of track it. In terms of where the rubber meets the road and this actual block of water actually moves to the lake, and how do we account for that? That's a much trickier situation, and I'm not sure that we have a really clear line of sight on it. So we have a lot of great proposals, a lot of great investments in ag water optimization and secondary metering and rip the strip. What we don't have is a system that's really designed to account for those water savings and ensure that a portion of those water savings go to the lake. We don't have that.
Well, and I understand that, but I think
Yeah.
you've got public bodies that are making public commitments to what they're doing. That seems like the lowest hanging fruit to
Sure.
say, great, you said it in a public meeting, you made that commitment to the constituents and to the lake. Who's tracking it to make sure it's happening? The other ones that you just mentioned are much broader. They're probably not going to be as finite in terms of the amounts that are being committed. But like I said, I'm in these meetings constantly and hear, you know, modest 4,000 acre feet, okay? Modest commitment from the point of the mountain yesterday. They have 4 water rights, you know, that they have on that site. And then the 30,000 here and the 20,000 there. And I just, what I would love to see is the low-hanging fruit where people have made public commitments. Who's tracking it and how do we know it's getting there?
And I think it's their obligation to make sure they live up to those commitments, but we do have a water engineer to track it, the state engineer to track it.
Joe?
Tim, I appreciate the compliments and shout out. We are engaged, as engaged as anybody. I would only comment on the kind of the overshoot, overbuild comment, because the salinity berm that's being considered now is temporary, and temporary has regulatory meaning. Arguably, temporary means a solution that's constructed and implemented within a 1-year time frame. So I think we have sufficient data to come up with an exact number. And if we're blessed with incredibly great inflow, I think we're sufficiently nimble in the Salinity Advisory Committee if we need to add more beyond what a reasonable proposal would be. I think that can be done quickly. So if we start overbuilding, you kind of get outside of the realm of temporary, and that's concerning because if you're outside of temporary, you're in a permanent position, and it's arguable as to whether additional permitting or authorizations would be required with the construction of a permanent fixture in the lake.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate that. Let's move to our next agenda item. Several years ago, the Advisory Council sponsored a study on the consequences of drying lakes around the world. One of the lakes we looked at was Lake Ermia. Prior to our study and subsequent to our study, Wayne Wurtzbau's had his sleeves rolled up and working on that lake and others. And Wayne's here to talk to us today about his report on contrasting management and fates of 2 sister lakes, the Great Salt Lake and Lake Ermia. Thanks, Wayne.
Thanks, John. Thanks all of you for coming. Got a little bit of cold, so I may be a little croaky here, but so I have had the opportunity to visit Lake Ermia.
Those participating remotely are unable to hear. Could we please have a microphone handed to the gentleman?
Okay, thanks for having me. And I have had the opportunity to visit Lake Ermia once and have worked with researchers from there and others from USU on Lake Ermia and comparing and contrasting it. And this particular presentation today comes out of a paper that I did with a researcher from Iran, Sumaya Sima, and published in the journal Water. And you can see from this picture here how similar the two lakes are. They're really remarkably similar. Lake Ermia lies in the northwestern corner of Iran, and in many ways the landscape looks like what we have here. They have arid lands, large cities, ski areas in the watershed. So there's a lot of similarities, and I think we can gain something by looking at what they've done or haven't done and how it affects us. My co-author on this is Samaya Seema. She's from Tarbrit Modarres University in Tehran. And she visited us for about 6 months on a sabbatical here at Utah State University, and worked with Sarah Knoll, David Rosenberg, Carton Kettering, and myself from the university. So the similarities. Well, first off, they have the same shape. They're divided in half by causeways. This is an automobile causeway that divides Ermea in half. Elevation is almost identical. The natural lake area is very similar. The current lake area isn't so similar because they've desiccated their lake more than we have. So we're 46% of kind of the natural area, and they're at 31% or less. Lake volume, it's a bit shallower lake, so their volume is a little less, with a mean depth of, in Great Salt Lake, 5.7 meters, and Ermea 3.9. Although I might say the morphometry of their lake, Lake Ermea, has not been as carefully assessed as what we have here. Watershed area, very similar. Irrigated agriculture, quite a bit more agriculture in the Ermea Basin. We'll go into that a little bit later. And the population in the watershed is almost double. Both Iran and Utah have very high population growth rates, about 1.9% per year. Iran had a few thousand-year head start, so the population and human density are higher there in Utah. So if we look at, this is for all of Iran where we had the population growth data. But if you look at the watershed of Lake Ermea and Great Salt Lake, they're essentially double 100 people per square kilometer versus 50 kilometers here. So a lot more demand there on the water. To support the growing populations, Iran and Utah began major irrigation projects. So we can see here a graph from 1900 up to 2020, and this is the storage capacity on this axis in cubic kilometers, or over here in billions of acre feet. And we see this incremental increase starting really 1920s, 30s for the Great Salt Lake, and sort of capped out here after about, 1990 or something like that. Whereas for Lake Ermea, they started much later, and they really didn't start to about 2000 to develop agricultural water projects to provide food self-sufficiency. And in part, that was driven by sanctions from the western U.S. that was restricting imports and exports. And you can see from the graph and down here, here's all the reservoirs in red in the Ermea Basin. And remember that the area of the watersheds is almost identical, yet they have their watershed their storage capacity is 188% of what we have here. So they really made an effort to capture a lot of water. And the uses of that water, in some ways similar. So agriculture for Utah is around 63%, or I shouldn't say Utah, Great Salt Lake Basin. And in Iran, it's 89%. So they're really utilizing a lot for ag, where we have more diverse utilizations here. Another difference is their lower latitude, and so a warmer climate. So they have Great Salt Lake's freeze-free period, frost-free period, 167 days. Lake Ermea, roughly 232 days. Right. So the longer freeze period for Ermea means that irrigated farming is more prolonged than in the Great Salt Lake Basin. And they have different crops. Ermea grains and cereals are dominant, but they have forage plants and vegetables. And I didn't find a real breakdown for Great Salt Lake, but alfalfa and corn are dominant in the basin. In the Lake Ermea Basin and most of Iran, they have limited agricultural land, with most crop production occurring in irrigated river valleys, like you can see in that photo there. And in contrast, the U.S. has extensive agricultural lands, the Great Plains, where we have immense food production capacity. Food production in Utah, I ran across this publication down here by Bingham, and it just came out this past year, 2022, and it was a county-by-county breakdown of self-sufficiency for food. And it's color shading here, and 0 to 1% of food is produced in the county, or 1 to 5%, and so on and so forth. And most counties in the Great Basin provide less than 15% of their own food, okay? Only Cache County, where I'm from here, has a higher investment, okay? And consequently, although we talk about providing water for agriculture so we can be self-sufficient, this is really kind of largely a myth, right? Utah's agriculture, production, and processing industries represent 2.7% of the state's gross domestic product. That's 2020 data. And agriculture is also a small employer in the population in the Great Basin, about 1%. In contrast to Ermea, where roughly 28% of the people are employed in agriculture. Now, that said, there are a lot of other benefits from agriculture. So here's a pasture near my home in North Logan, and I really like having that pasture there and hiking near it and providing open space. So although food sufficiency may not be, really something we need to work that hard about, open space is another aspect of it that we do need to be concerned with. Okay, so consumptive use, you've all seen this graph. Consumptive use has slowly driven down the level of Great Salt Lake so that the impact of water diversions, water use wasn't noticed until careful modeling was done by Craig Miller in the Division of Water Resources, and we've all heard that story before. Drought now has driven down things about 1.8 meters. Consumptive use, we estimate, or Craig estimates, 3.4 meters. So both of those have major impact on the lake. It was kind of a different story in Lake Ermea. Things went along, and they had some wet years in the 80s like we did, and then they started their dam building in around 1900, and the lake level just plummeted, right? They've had a bit of a drought, but consumptive use is really driving things down. And here's last September, we thought Great Salt Lake was in bad shape. Lake Ermea is really drying up, right? This is just precipitation in the Ermea Basin. Ups and downs like we have, wet years, dry years, but no significant long-term change. So it's not climate change per se that's driving things. A little after we saw some data earlier, I'm a little wary about my South Arm Great Salt Lake salinity graph here. I thought it was right, but I'll have to look at that. But if we look at Lake Ermea here, the salinity, dropped down to about 150 grams per liter in the mid 1990s, something like that. And as they've desiccated the lake, it's just gone up and up. And so now they're over 350 grams per liter. The composition has changed radically. It used to be sodium chloride dominated like we were here. Now that it's magnesium and sulfate dominated. This is from a different paper that's Samaya Simi was the lead author on with some of us from USU, but she and I put together this graph. This is salinity, grams per liter down on the x-axis, and the density, number per cubic meter of adult Artemia. All right, and so we see a trend for decreasing brine shrimp densities here. And I don't know if you can see this. The probability here is 0.09. So in scientific community, we wouldn't even consider that a significant decline. And a lot of that is driven by a couple somewhat outlier points here. All right. In Lake Ermea, they have a different species, Artemia ermiana, and it's larger, quite a bit larger species. And as best as I could, I put together the data, and these are from a variety of different studies, and they use different sampling methods and stuff, so we're not real confident in exactly that line, but still they've been recording significant populations of Artemia out to 300 grams per liter. There has been some tests done on Artemia nopuli in the laboratory, and this species seems to be more resistant to salinity than the Franciscana species we have here. But even those studies were not real convincing. But they have, you see here, well, I don't know if you can see it, 0.03 is the probability level for this decline. So they're having considerable declines in Artemia. In 2013, they said, the Iranian government said, oh my goodness, we developed all this water and our lake's drying up, but we love our lake and it's really culturally very important, supports large bird populations like we do here, has dust problems like we do here. And so they started the Ermea Lake Recovery Project, but the lake was down at 12% of its natural volume when they started that. And the government pledged $5 billion for recovery. I don't know what actually has been spent and whether they really come up with that, but they were very serious about that. And they set a target elevation of 1,274 meters and a salinity of 270 grams per liter to support the brine shrimp, which were fed on by flamingos and a lot of other birds that utilize the lake. We'll see in a second on another graph, really very limited research evidence to support that target goal, but that's what they went with. Utah initiated their recovery efforts when the lake was 30% of its natural volume, all right? So we've got a head start on them in that respect. Some of the research and management differences. This is a ferry that used to come up to that automobile causeway, and you see it's not very functional now. One of the differences is that the proximity of the universities and researchers to Great Salt Lake led to earlier and more publications on Great Salt Lake than for Lake Ermea, all right? Where many of the research institutions are located 500 kilometers away in Tehran. And we did a Scopus literature review. This just goes to the peer-reviewed literature, not governmental publications. But for Great Salt Lake, we found 386 publications that started in 1889 and went to 2022, all right? For Lake Ermea, 184 publications not beginning until 1986, so much later start. This is just English literature, not Farsi literature, so that may modify things a little bit. But the topics investigated are very different. So the blue indicates studies on Lake Ermea, and 39% of the studies that have been done were on hydrology, climate, and weather, all right? And more on sociology, health, anthropogenic, and economics than the red indicates here for Great Salt Lake. Where they're really lacking is for the biology, ecology, and limnology. You know, we've had 53 studies, they've only had 14 studies published, so on and so forth. The recovery efforts for Lake Ermea are largely led by engineers and hydrologists, all right, with essentially no limnologists working there on the lake. Whereas the recovery effort for Great Salt Lake is by a mix of biologists, limnologists, hydrologists, and engineers. So we've got a better perspective and a better background for understanding our system. Another difference in management approaches is that Utah managers recognize the environmental importance of wetlands and have dedicated about 13% of water inflows to the diked wetlands that surround the lake. The emphasis at Lake Ermea is to meet that target elevation of the lake that they set by whatever means. So that's involved channelization and drying of wetlands to route water directly to the lake. So the goals of the Lake Ermea Recovery Project was early on they set a target goal for elevation and salinity, set a water right of 3.43 kilometers per year, 2.78 million acre feet. They wanted to reduce agriculture water use by 40%, and they set out to do an interbasin water transfer of 0.62 cubic kilometers from the Lesser Zob River, which flows into Iraq, actually, eventually in the Tigris, and with a $3.2 billion, 36-kilometer long tunnel. So agricultural water releases from the upstream reservoirs have been reduced. They're releasing less water for agriculture, but that reduction hasn't resulted in much water actually reaching Great Salt Lake because of uncontrolled water withdrawals between the dams and the lake. Since the project began in 2013, Lake Ermea has only received its complete water allocation in 2 out of 9 years. The tunnel is not yet completed, despite a lot of cost overruns. The lake, as we saw, is at its near all-time low level, is really ecologically dysfunctional, and there's severe dust storms from the lake bed. So the moral of this, and we all know this, it's easier to provide farmers water for farmers than to take it away. Great Salt Lake recovery efforts, we haven't set a target elevation yet, and we talk about a salinity goal, but we haven't really implemented one. Tim went through all the legislation that was done last year with a great start by the legislature. But the results are so far minimal releases of water from industry and water districts that are really dedicated to the lake. There's efforts, but not a lot of water. Continued legislative action is expected, as Tim outlined, but so far insignificant water dedicated to the problem. Just kind of in conclusion here, we're in a crisis and we're worried about year-to-year efforts, but we really need to step back and also think about the long-term viability of Great Salt Lake and Lake Ermea. And neither Iran or Utah seems to be addressing the underlying problem, which is population growth. Okay. Instead of trying to curtail growth so we don't exceed water availability, like living within our means, we're actually trying to increase the population. So we have tax credits for people to have children. We have tax breaks for companies to move to Utah to bring people that need water, and the industries themselves need water. So for the long term, we need to think out, if we extrapolate what even beyond what, like this Great Salt Lake Tribune prediction got us up to around 5 million. If we extrapolate that out to end of the century, we're at 8 million or something like that. It's dangerous to do those sorts of extrapolation, but we've been growing steadily and increasing our population, so we need to be thinking about that in the long term. And changing our perspective on growth will be difficult, given that Utah and the rest of the U.S. has been developing for decades with a growth economy. That's just how we've been operating, not only in Utah, throughout the U.S. So this is a quote from the St. George News. St. George Council warns that stalled water supply could put brakes on growth economy. Okay, they're looking at that as that's how they manage things. We're going to be growing. They want to grow. And putting the brakes on a growing population is an extremely slow process. But if we don't start now, we'll have a population of 8 million people in Utah, and it will be very difficult to have a really functioning Great Salt Lake. So I'll leave it there and take any questions.
One question or comment? Great, thank you, Wayne, appreciate that. Let's jump to the next item. Joanna Enterwada from Utah State University has appeared before us previously to talk about a process they were undertaking to gather some public opinion information. She's here today to report on the results. Joanna, thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to the council. We came to the council with funding we already had in hand and asked for some feedback from you on the survey, The Future of Great Salt Lake. We took that into account. It greatly improved the survey, and we're here to present some preliminary results. I want to acknowledge that this is a collaborative process. Myself, Dr. Lisa Welsh, who's here, and Dr. Karen Kettenring. And here we have our funders who help fund the project. The survey consisted, some of you hopefully saw it, some of you hopefully have taken the open public version of it, but it had these 5 different sections in it. But the main purpose of the survey was to find out what people were willing to do in terms of strategies for protecting the lake and its wetlands. There were 2 different forms of the survey. The first was a random sample population of the entire state of Utah, or all the counties within Utah, in 3 different strata. One, the counties of where the Great Salt Lake lies within other Great Salt Lake watershed counties was the second strata, and then other Utah counties. So surveys went out to all counties throughout the state. We also had, after we initiated the survey, the random sample survey in September, we got permission from the IRB at Utah State University to open a public version of the survey. There were press releases from Utah State University, and we've let people know about this. This one's open until the end of January, so those of you who would like to participate in the study, please feel free to go online and provide us with your feedback. And I have my, I'm sorry I forgot to bring flyers, but if you don't capture this, email me afterwards and we'll make sure that you get a copy. So we had the random sample survey open through the end of December. We did a couple waves of reminders, and hard copies were sent out in one of the subsequent rounds prior to first inviting people to participate online. So some of those are still coming in. We have secured approximately 1,100 surveys, and 90% of them are already entered in the system. So since we still had some coming in, this is based on 90% of the survey returns that we got from that. Since the public survey is still open, we're not presenting those results today, but we wanted to give you this overview of what we're finding. So approximately 90% of the respondents had heard or read about concerns over the decline of the Great Salt Lake prior to taking this survey, and we're glad we asked that question just to find out what they knew. We asked them about the sources of information that they have on Great Salt Lake issues. And here are the percentage of respondents that said that they relied on these various sources of information. Interestingly, traditional media sources topped the list, and maybe in part because there's been so much traditional media attention to this in the past couple of months, but their personal experience and observations. For all of us in this room, government agencies and environmental organizations, universities, schools, you know, are a little bit lower relied upon as sources of information. And so here you kind of see only 4% were not familiar with Great Salt Lake. So at least people are familiar with it. We asked them how they're connected to Great Salt Lake. Here you see But the top of the list, and these are all exactly how the responses appeared in the survey. We haven't shortened them. We asked them on this. But this is not the order in which they appeared. We, on all of the questions, generally put the answers in an alphabetical order, so that we weren't privileging anything in particular. But just appreciating the values of the lake and caring about its future really topped the list in a significant way here. And we thought that was very interesting. And then they have other kinds of personal connections to the lake because it was a statewide survey. These lower percentages of owning property near the lake or working and receiving household income understandably came out a little bit lower. But 13% already said they don't feel connected to the lake. So, there's some that, especially in the statewide survey, they don't feel personally connected. We asked them about specific places that were important. Here, you see the ones that came to the top of the kinds of places that they're interested in visiting, they feel connected to. So our second section was on their views of the Great Salt Lake, and we asked them a variety of questions. So the first was the meanings, values, and uses of the Great Salt Lake, its islands and surrounding wetlands, the meanings those have for respondents. And what's really interesting here is the fact that the uniqueness and the ecology of the lake, these top responses came out on top. I've put in white here, the scale was from absolutely essential to very important. So when you see these listed, the means on the responses, came out in that category between very important and absolutely essential. But of average importance to very important, there are a lot of other values that people respect and care about the lake for. Those are listed here, and these were forced choice answers, but we tried to cover a lot of the things that the lake is known for. Interestingly, brine shrimp was the lowest value that people recognized. But the fact that brine shrimp are so important for the wildlife just might be something they don't recognize because the habitat for wildlife really comes out on top. And so just in terms of presenting these results, I want you to think both of the policy implications as well as, and I think the council's been interested in this, the educational opportunities, how this helps guide some educational efforts in the future. We asked them just 3 questions or phrases that they thought about when they thought about the lake. Here's an initial just sort of word diagram showing you the kinds of things that came to mind as they think about the lake. So it's big, beautiful, and stinky and smelly, but iconic and wonderful in a lot of different ways. So we asked them about their concern of various circumstances concerning the lake and these levels of concern. You can see they're concerned about habitat loss, shrinkage, toxic dust, sustaining the ecological health of the lake, and Bear River water projects that could divert water. They're, also concerned about these other things that are highlighted, pollutants and salinity and urban development and invasive species, expansion of mineral extraction, loss of economic activity, impacts the winter sports activity. And then lower down are some other concerns. But they were all, various levels of concern here that you can see of things that we included. Overall, we asked them, how do you think your own quality of life would be effective if Great Salt Lake dried up? And the mean was in the very negatively category. Of course, there was responses all across the board, but this one, it was overwhelmingly toward a negative impact that they would experience personally. We left then a couple places in the survey, this is one of them, where there was a space for them to say in their own words what they thought as a follow-up to the question. And on this, we asked, well, how would your quality of life be affected? And here's some of the just samples of responses. Many, many very articulate, passionate very interesting responses, and so we're hoping to provide much more detail on that in the report we write. But we'd lose the place of great beauty, and they're worried about dust and the loss of a major flyway. So a replay of the Aral Sea disaster, many people are aware of the fact that we aren't the only saline lake that's drying up, and that there are experiences around the world, and that those have been negative experiences. And so I think they touched stone with those in seeing ahead what we could experience here. We had a series of statements that we asked them how much they agreed with. These are the statements that rose to the top. And again, on a scale of 1 to 5. And so here are the ones that are somewhere between 4 and 5. Utah needs to implement water-efficient growth strategies to preserve Great Salt Lake. Leadership from Utah legislators and statewide elected officials is critical for protecting the lake. Great Salt Lake is important to me even if I do not spend time there. Leadership from city leaders, also critical. And securing water for Great Salt Lake will require major changes in how water is allocated and managed in Utah. These are statements that they agreed with, somewhere between strongly agree and agree. So the next slide shows you statements that they agreed with, but a little bit lower down, recognizing that preserving the lake's a collective legacy Utahns should leave for future generations. That the decline of the lake will reduce Utah's desirability as a place to live, conduct business, work, and that future costs to restore Great Salt Lake would far exceed the current benefits of diverting water for Great Salt Lake. So these were some questions trying to get at trade-offs and how they perceive those, and they agreed with these statements. Statements that they disagreed with. In light of climate change and growth, efforts to preserve Great Salt Lake seem insurmountable. They don't think they think we can save the Great Salt Lake. They want to save the Great Salt Lake. And most interestingly, the lowest one on the agreement, which was on the disagreement side of the midpoint, flows of water that reach Great Salt Lake are wasted. That has so long been a mantra of Utah, and they disagree with that. They recognize that water is important for sustaining the lake. So, securing water for Great Salt Lake. Let me try to go fast. The opinions on securing water for the Great Salt Lake, we asked in this section, what would you do individually? Individual strategies, community strategies, and then state-level strategies. And here you can see that there are quite a number of things not up in the very willing category, but they are on the willing side to do things on their own properties, as you can see here, that would help to conserve water. You know, even accepting that their children and grandchildren may not live in Utah because of water scarcity. So they are a little less willing, but to accept higher density housing and compact development in their neighborhood, but that is sort of one of the things on the horizon as a means to save water. So here's that scale on their willingness to take actions at an individual scale. What would motivate them, though, to reduce their water use? This question note was phrased, if they knew the water they conserved would be put toward the following uses. So they are motivated to conserve when they know that that conserved water is going to these values that they care about. Improved habitat, stream flow, increasing the water levels, reducing their water bill, and ensuring water sufficient for the future, seeing a future here in this place. They are not as motivated if they know that it is going to increase development in their area. They aren't motivated to conserve, to fuel future growth. We also ask them about what they're willing to pay, knowing that there are costs involved in saving the Great Salt Lake. Willingness to pay surveys are very complicated in and of themselves, so we just had a more simple, open-ended question. How much would you be willing to pay per year via these various means for the Great Salt Lake. And here you can see some of the prices. What was interesting is that most respondents were willing to pay in more than one way, and on average, they were willing to pay about between $300 and $350 per year at their household level if that water was going via one of these means to help secure water for the Great Salt Lake. So it is at least letting you know that the public knows that we need investments in the Great Salt Lake. And so as legislators look to how to raise that funding, there is a fair amount of public support for that. And only 10% weren't willing to pay anything. So just find it interesting that they are willing to pay some money for this. Community strategies, they really want to, here you can see the responses, their level of support for what they want their community to do, but they don't want communities to overextend the water supply. They want to know it's adequate, sustainable, that they need better, transparent, and informative water bills so that they can conserve better, protect sensitive water resources and land use planning, and some of these other things that they would support. Mandatory outdoor water restrictions, land use ordinances and building codes that would help with efficiency, graduated tiered rates, limited amount of turf, bill people for the water they use after you've installed those secondary meters, increase water prices to reflect the full cost of water. So here's quite a few things that they're willing to support. I think overall, you're seeing that there's a takeaway that the public's getting the point that we've got to do a lot of effort for Great Salt Lake. It's showing up over and over in these various responses. We asked them about their satisfaction with local leaders, and they were a little on the dissatisfied side of thinking that they could do more, and they wanted to see more action. Again, here's state-level strategies, and this follows along with some of the things that Tim was talking about, but even more broadly, just ensuring that water conservation and efficiency is pursued prior to new water infrastructure projects, and more statewide planning for climate and drought resilience, and coordinating with the federal government, prioritizing water demand management, assessing trade-offs. You can see the responses here. So there was all of these, again, on the support side. No one of these comments came out on the we don't support or only slightly support or somewhat support. All these means, this is really interesting, are above 3, the midpoint. So they're supportive of a lot of these actions. Prioritizing goals for Utah's water management, good drinking water, water quality, water for ag, Great Salt Lake, top of the list. Recreation and some of the other things are lower down. Even saving taxpayer money is a lower down goal in terms of prioritizing what to do about water. Here's the satisfaction overall of state legislators. Again, a little on the dissatisfied side, but wanting even more action. So our final section, vision on the future Great Salt Lake. Here's one where we gave them 2 open-ended questions and asked them to complete the sentence and left them a lot of space to do so. And the first one, the sentence starts with, the future of Great Salt Lake, and they needed to complete the sentence. And here are just a couple of examples of things that they said. And there were a range of responses. Most of them on the side, overwhelmingly on the side of the future is bleak, we need to do something, we need collective action strategies, but some still saying, well, maybe that's not something we should be doing. So there are very rich responses here that we're going to work on analyzing in greater depth. Here's a couple more of those, the future of Great Salt Lake. And you can read those there. the other sentence that we asked them closing out the survey is, I think protecting Great Salt Lake as a public trust resource means, and then they completed that sentence. And here's some of the results acknowledging that we have responsibility as stewards for the land we live on, our collective willingness to sacrifice and more wisely use our limited resources. Sinking money into an unnecessary lake, that's one of the ones on the other side, but thoughtfully developing policies and actions to mediate the problems of too much or too little water. We need to be more able to adapt the situation. They are just amazing responses. People, when given the chance to tell what they think, took that, and we hope to convey that and reflect it back as we write this up. So a lot of interesting response themes that run throughout the survey, expressions of fears, alarm, frustration, and cynicism, but also a lot of hope, passion, commitment, and trust that we can do this if we work together in trying to save the Great Salt Lake. And some of the things that they want. That's our takeaways if we started to look at this. So anyway, we're hoping to have more information, a full report for you at a later time. So there's our preliminary.
Thank you, Joanna. Very interesting. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
We'll try and be efficient and wrap up quickly here. We have a practice at our meetings of inviting public comment. Is there anyone here today who would like to share a public comment? Thank you. You just saved us 10 minutes. I would ask any council members if they have any suggestions for future meeting topics, please let Marissa or myself know. We'd like to get working on the next meeting agenda. Also, at our next meeting for council members, we will begin the discussion of which projects we want to support or sponsor or fund in the next fiscal year. So be thinking of that, and if you could share in advance with Marissa or myself your thoughts on what studies or projects we should undertake. Our next meeting is on Wednesday, March 8th, and it will be held at the Farmington Bay Wildlife Education Center, the Eccles Center there. I appreciate your being here. Any final comments from, yes, Marissa?
Sorry, Don, I just have a brief announcement. Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is also requesting hot topic suggestions until January 20th for the tech team grants. The tech team will finalize the hot topics before sending out an RFP. This deadline is earlier than in previous years, as we want to be able to award these contracts prior to the start of the fiscal year. Please feel free to reach out to myself or Ben Steyerman with topics or ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you. Second, any debate or discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Any abstentions? That's unanimous. Thank you for being here, everyone.